Hi, my name is Dylan Wynn. I'm a research assistant with the Houston Education Research Consortium, and I want to thank you for joining me today as I share findings from the Student Mobility and Continuous Enrollment Project. Specifically, today we'll answer the question, what are the key predictors of campus-level continuous enrollment at schools in the Houston area? To begin, this presentation will proceed as follows. We'll start by looking at our specific research question, then we'll highlight the key takeaways. Next, we'll dig into a little more detail about the study, including definitions used and analyses run in order to arrive at our conclusions. Finally, we'll wrap up the presentation with a summary of findings and discussion of next steps. So let's get started. For this analysis, the question we sought to answer was, what predicts the percent of students continuously enrolled at a campus in the Houston area? In general, 4 buckets of predictors were considered. We included student body characteristics, so things like race, ethnicity composition at a school, campus star score performance, and prior year's continuous enrollment. Campus features such as grade level taught, that's elementary, middle, and high school, average teacher experience, school size. We also looked at availability of alternative options, that is to say, how many other schools were nearby that the student could have attended. And finally, we looked at neighborhood characteristics, like unemployment rate, percent with a bachelor's degree or higher, and percent English speakers. Together, these variables allowed us to model potential push and pull factors that would affect the percent of continuously enrolled students at a campus. What we found is that despite including all these different things in our analyses, there was a clear, strongest predictor of continuous enrollment: previous year's continuous enrollment. Other student body characteristics, campus features, alternative options, and neighborhood contexts were not very strong predictors of continuous enrollment. To be clear, some of these other things were statistically significant predictors, but substantively, the best predictor of a campus's current continuous enrollment is its continuous enrollment from the previous year. But before we begin to dig into these findings, it's important to establish what we mean by continuous enrollment, or CE. There are 2 cases to consider when classifying a student as such. If the student is in the 3rd grade, they must have been enrolled in the same district for the previous 2 years for them to be defined as continuously enrolled. For 4th graders and above, this time span is increased to consider the previous 3 years. With these student-level definitions of continuous enrollment, we then calculate a campus's continuous enrollment as a percent by dividing the number of continuously enrolled students at a campus by the number of eligible students at a campus, and then multiplying that number by 100. This measure, percent of eligible students at a campus who are continuously enrolled, is what we will be using as the outcome variable for the analyses discussed in this presentation. Now that we have laid the groundwork for the analyses we conducted, we can take a closer look at what factors we considered when predicting a campus's continuous enrollment. Starting with student body characteristics, we looked at a campus's continuous enrollment from the previous year, the race, ethnic composition of students in the school, performance of students on the STAR test, index 1 to be exact, percent of students classified as limited English proficient, or LEP, and the percent of students qualifying for free or reduced price lunch. For campus features, we considered grade levels taught at a school, school size, that is the number of students, average teacher experience at a campus, as well as the school year. Next, shifting focus to factors outside of a campus that might affect its percent continuous enrollment, we controlled for the number of other schools available to a student within a 10-minute drive, thinking of these as alternatives. In particular, we looked at the number of charter schools, private schools, and other public schools within a 10-minute drive of a campus. Finally, we included variables describing the neighborhood in which the school was located. Specifically, we included measures for percent of female-headed households, unemployment rate, percent of households with a bachelor's degree or higher, and percent of households where English was a secondary language. While we included this full set of variables in the model, not all of them were significant, and this graphic highlights the ones that showed up as significant in our analyses. One of the first findings that pops out is that none of the campus feature variables were significant in these final models. But of the student body variables, a campus's continuous enrollment from the previous year, percent race ethnicity, and STAR score performance were each significant predictors of a campus's continuous enrollment. For alternative options, the number of regular schools nearby and the number of private schools nearby were significant predictors. And finally, from the neighborhood characteristics, the labor force participation measure, that is to say the unemployment rate of a neighborhood, was related to a campus's continuous enrollment. Taking all this in, it might seem at first glance that several different factors are involved in a somewhat convoluted story around campus continuous enrollment, But the truth is, the story really only boils down to a single factor: last year's continuous enrollment rate. To drive home this point, we can look at the magnitude of previous year's continuous enrollment in a couple of different ways. So first, here we can see that our models do a pretty good job predicting a campus's continuous enrollment rate. Nearly 90% of current year's continuous enrollment is accounted for in these models. However, we see that the vast majority of that, 80% in total, is accounted for solely by previous year's continuous enrollment rate. Next, we can contrast the size of the coefficient associated with previous year's CE with other variables that were statistically significant. Here, we see previous year's continuous enrollment has a slope coefficient of about 0.8, much larger than the other significant factors, none of which are bigger than about 0.05. This means that for every 1 percentage point change in previous year's CE, it is associated with a 0.8 percentage point change in current year CE, while all of the other factors are associated with changes in current year CE that are close to 0. So, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, previous year continuous enrollment was the strongest predictor of campus's current continuous enrollment. Furthermore, various student, campus, and neighborhood level factors were related to continuous enrollment rate, but they made marginal contributions at best, particularly relative to previous year CE. Finally, we find that this pattern holds true across campuses serving different grade levels, as well as for Black and Hispanic majority campuses and economic disadvantaged majority campuses. These analyses are not shown here, but are available upon request. So where do these analyses leave us? For next steps, district-specific results will be shared out in the near future, and you guessed it, we also see previous year CE as the strongest predictor of current CE across all districts. However, while we are left with a clear trajectory of continuous enrollment begetting continuous enrollment, it does prompt some additional questions aimed at disentangling the cyclical nature of continuous enrollment patterns. In particular, further research can explore what are the best predictors of previous year continuous enrollment. Has it always been a significant predictor of current year CE, or is this a recent phenomenon? And finally, why is previous CE such a powerful predictor of current CE? That is to say, what features of a school set into motion the cycle over time? It is also worth mentioning that this analysis relied on the state's definition of continuous enrollment, which defines continuous enrollment based on students staying in the same district, not the same campus, or even feeder pattern of campuses. Different definitions of continuous enrollment, especially ones that really prioritize stability in campus attended, could return very different results, where prior continuous enrollment does not so consistently predict future enrollment. So, an additional next step could be to examine this definition and consider reconceptualizing it. Finally, before I conclude, I want to share a quick comment on what we included in this presentation's appendix. As you can see, most campuses have CE rates greater than 50%, and many of the districts considered in these analyses don't have any campuses that had CE rates lower than 40%. As a quick quality control check on the analyses reported here today, we ran all these models again, but first dropping any campuses with less than 40% CE. The results were nearly identical. Previous year continuous enrollment continued to be the best predictor of a campus's current year continuous enrollment. And with that, that concludes this presentation on predicting a campus's continuous enrollment. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please feel free to reach out to me, Dylan Nguyen, or Gabriela Sanchez and Daniel Potter at the emails listed on the slide. Also, to stay up to date on the latest presentations from HERC, please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page, and thank you for checking out this and other videos on our channel. Have a great day.